Imagine a world where the Roman Empire never fell, a world where the light of classical antiquity never flickered out, where the Renaissance happened 1,000 years early, and where the Industrial Revolution began in the streets of Rome rather than the factories of Manchester. It's a compelling alternate history, but it isn't just a fantasy. It was a very real possibility that hinged on a single afternoon in the year 468 AD. History books often tell us that Rome fell because of corrupt emperors, lead pipes, or unstoppable waves of barbarians. But the truth is much more clinical and much more devastating. It comes down to a single catastrophic financial gamble, a $500 billion mistake that didn't just bankrupt an empire, it ended a civilization. This is the story of the Battle of Cap Bon, the greatest military expedition in the history of the ancient world, and the moment the Roman Empire bet its entire existence on a single roll of the dice and lost everything. To understand the magnitude of this mistake, we have to look at the state of the world in the middle of the 5th century. By 468 AD, the Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self, split into two halves. The Eastern Empire, governed from the magnificent walls of Constantinople, was still wealthy and powerful, but the Western Empire, centered in Italy, was dying. It had lost Gaul to the Franks, Spain to the Visigoths, and Britain to the Shadows. But the most painful loss wasn't a province in Europe, it was North Africa. For centuries, North Africa had been the breadbasket of Rome. It provided the grain that fed the millions of citizens in Italy, and the tax revenue that paid the legions. In 439 AD, a Germanic tribe called the Vandals, led by their cunning King Gaiseric, crossed the Pillars of Hercules and seized Carthage. This was the beginning of the end. Gaiseric wasn't just another barbarian chieftain looking for land. He was a strategic genius who realized that if he controlled the Mediterranean sea lanes, he controlled the throat of Rome. He built a pirate kingdom that terrorized the coasts of Italy and Greece, and in 455 AD, he did the unthinkable. He sailed up the Tiber and sacked the city of Rome itself. This wasn't like the earlier sack by the Goths. This was a systematic 2-week-long stripping of the city's wealth. The Romans were humiliated, starving, and broke. But the Eastern Emperor, Leo I, realized that if the West fell, the East would eventually follow. He decided that the Vandals had to be destroyed once and for all. He began planning the largest amphibious invasion the world would see until D-Day in 1944. But an operation of this scale required money that neither empire actually had. To fund this expedition, Leo I emptied the imperial treasuries of Constantinople. He implemented emergency taxes, sold off state property, and even melted down gold statues. The total cost was recorded as 130,000 pounds of gold. When you adjust for the total economic output of the 5th century world and the sheer purchasing power of gold at the time, this wasn't just a few billion dollars. It represented the combined liquid wealth of the entire Mediterranean world. In today's terms, we are talking about a $500 billion investment. This wasn't just a war effort. It was the largest concentrated expenditure of capital in human history up to that point. It was a go big or go home moment. If they won, the Vandals would be crushed, North Africa would be recovered, the grain would flow, and the Roman Empire would be restored to its full glory. If they lost, there would be no more money for soldiers, no more money for walls, and no more Rome. The scale of the fleet was terrifying. Over 1,100 ships were assembled, carrying an estimated 100,000 soldiers and sailors. To put that in perspective, that's more people than the entire population of many major cities at the time. The horizon must have been a forest of masts and sails. The Roman people felt a surge of hope they hadn't felt in a century. This was the moment the tide would turn. But even the best-funded military in the world is only as good as the man leading it. And this is where the $500 billion mistake moves from a financial gamble to a human tragedy. Through a combination of political maneuvering and family influence, the command of this massive armada was given to a man named Basiliscus. Basiliscus was the brother-in-law of the emperor, and while he was an experienced general, he was also notoriously arrogant and, as many historians suspect, potentially susceptible to bribes. As the Roman fleet approached the coast of North Africa near a place called Cap Bon, the Vandal King Gaiseric knew he was outmatched. On paper, he had no chance. His fleet was smaller, his soldiers were fewer, and his resources were depleted. So he did what any desperate leader would do. He lied. He sent messengers to Basiliscus, begging for a 5-day truce to negotiate the terms of his surrender. Basiliscus, believing he had already won, and perhaps hoping to secure a more profitable personal deal, granted the truce. He ordered his 1,100 ships to drop anchor in a tight, crowded bay and wait, It was the most expensive pause in history. While the Romans rested and waited for a surrender that would never come, the wind began to shift. Gaiseric was waiting for a northern wind, and on the 5th night it arrived. Under the cover of darkness, the Vandals prepared their fire ships. These were old vessels filled with dry brush, pitch, sulfur, and oil. As the wind picked up, the Vandals set these ships ablaze and guided them toward the crowded Roman harbor. Think about the scene. Over 1,000 Roman ships packed tightly together in a confined space, their crews asleep or relaxed, believing a peace treaty was imminent. Suddenly, out of the darkness, roaring walls of fire come drifting toward them on the wind. Because the Roman ships were so tightly packed, they couldn't maneuver. When a fire ship hit one Roman galley, the flames jumped to the next and then the next. The Roman fleet became a massive floating funeral pyre. Panic erupted. Soldiers tried to jump into the water, weighed down by their heavy armor, while others were burned alive on deck. Amidst the smoke and the screams, the Vandal fleet moved in to pick off the survivors. Basiliscus, seeing his $500 billion investment literally going up in smoke, fled. He abandoned his men and sailed back to Constantinople in shame. The loss was total. Over half the Roman fleet was destroyed. Tens of thousands of men were dead, and the gold, the 130,000 pounds of gold that represented the lifeblood of the empire, was gone. There was no insurance policy for this. There was no way to print more money. The Roman state was functionally bankrupt. The consequences of this failure were immediate and terminal. With the treasury empty, the Western Roman Empire could no longer pay its mercenary armies. In the ancient world, loyalty was bought with coin, and the coins had all been spent at Cap On. Without a military to defend the borders, the Germanic tribes within the empire realized the central government was powerless. Just 8 years after the disaster at Cap On, in 476 AD, the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic general named Odoacer. The Western Roman Empire, which had stood for over 1,000 years, simply ceased to exist. It didn't end with a bang of heroic resistance. It ended because the check bounced. We often like to think of history as a series of inevitable trends, the rise and fall of nations governed by the slow movements of culture and climate. But the Battle of Cat Bon reminds us that history can turn on a single decision, a single person's incompetence, and a single massive financial error. If Basiliscus had attacked immediately instead of granting that 5-day truce, the Vandals would have likely been crushed. Rome would have regained North Africa, stabilized its economy, and perhaps survived for centuries more. The Dark Ages might never have happened. The Library of Alexandria's knowledge might have been preserved. We might be living in a world today that is technologically and socially unrecognizable to us. But instead, the money was spent, the fire ships were launched, and the light of Rome went out. It serves as a haunting reminder that even the greatest empires are fragile, and their survival often depends not on their ideals or their culture, but on the cold, hard reality of their balance sheets. When a civilization spends everything it has on a single gamble and loses, there is rarely a second chance. The $500 billion mistake at Cap Bon didn't just change the map of Europe, it changed the trajectory of the human race. It proves that while money can't buy an empire's eternity, the loss of it can certainly guarantee its end.